Welcome to Let's Talk Blood Cancer, the Patients Podcast. My name is Adam Joyce, former blood cancer patient myself, and today I'm joined on the sofa by none other than Professor Charlie Craddock CBE, who is the man who got to tell me that I was cured. Charlie, welcome.
Wonderful to be here, Adam. Thank you.
Charlie, you started Cure Leukemia in 2003. Bit of a conversation over a packet of crisps in a cafe. Tell us about that.
Yes, it was inspired by a couple of really wonderful patients who we had put onto a clinical trial of a fantastically effective new drug in chronic myeloid leukemia. And the only way that we were able to open this trial, and these were a couple of patients who were some of the only patients in the UK accessing this breakthrough drug, was really by going round the country, particularly round our region, Birmingham, Shropshire and surrounding areas, raising money at clay pigeon shoots, chicken in a basket evenings, because we knew that we had to have a research nurse in our hospital to allow us to open this trial, to safely deliver the trial for patients, monitor their responses, and then do all the complex regulatory work. And one of the patients said, "This is just crazy. It's not a sustainable model." Their ability to access this drug had transformed their lives, and they felt that it was down to luck in a way, that we had managed to summon up these random amounts of money. And so with these wonderful two patients, we sat down actually in a shop in Hales Owen over a bag of crisps and a sandwich during a lunchtime break and said, let's make this a bit more professional. Let's create an infrastructure through a charity that allows us to hardwire funding for research nurses, first of all in the West Midlands in the region, and then more recently, as we'll probably discuss, nationally. So it was that idea that really it's so important for patients to see these new treatments that we had to take the luck out of the process. And Cure Leukemia wouldn't have been formed without patients telling the story that we want to see these drugs and we need to do more to make the infrastructure in our hospitals permissive to patients going on clinical trials.
So, Charlie, you talk about clinical trials, you've spoken about research nurses. This will be language that will be alien to lots of people watching this podcast. There may be an expectation that you get blood cancer, go to hospital and are treated really well and really effectively and really successfully. So in which case, what's the need for Cure Leukemia?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Adam. And, you know, we have to look back on the fantastic progress that has been made in treating blood cancers. You know, one of the standout examples would be the progress that's been made with children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. It's the commonest leukemia in kids. And there, you know, you're looking at cure rates of 80 or 90%. And there are other, in adults, there are other diseases where there has been similar remarkable progress. So we have made progress, and that's really the beacon for our belief that we can get rid of this disease in 25 years. We will have effective treatments. The examples we have of where so much progress has been made, but on a daily basis when we sit with patients in clinic or on the ward, what we're aware of is that for a lot of our patients, we need much better treatments. And that's the urgency.
So picking up on patients in the wards, you've been in this industry, if I can call it that, for an awful long time. Why blood cancer, Charlie? Why did you choose that path? Because you're clearly a very clever man and you could have perhaps used your skills in lots of areas. Why blood cancer?
Yeah, it was a great question. I suppose there's just a couple of reasons, particularly. I loved my clinical medicine training, and I adored the contact with patients and just found whatever the diseases was sort of endless fascination, not only with the disease and how it might be treated, but also how resilient patients are, their humour, and also your ability to kind of build friendships really with families. But I was in my, I suppose, my early 30s, I was really unclear what bit of medicine I went into. And I actually did, for a period, think about leaving medicine. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but actually at that time, my favourite, preferred occupation would have been to become a crab fisherman.
I'm really glad you didn't leave.
I don't know. I think I might have been quite a good crab fisherman, actually. But the reason that I fell into haematology was really because of a couple of my mentors. One of them, John Goldman, was the inspirational leukemia and transplant physician in the United Kingdom. And I ended up working with John at the Hammersmith Hospital. And I was totally impressed by two things about him. The first was that he had meticulous interest, fascination in changing the outcomes for patients. John would do ward rounds at 2 in the morning. I, as a registrar, would go around at 9 o'clock to see patients, and they'd say things like, "Doctor, I think I'm hallucinating. I saw this man, very distinguished man with grey hair and a white coat. What drug am I on that's giving me?" I said, no, that's Professor Goldman, just doing his round, checking you out. So one is, John was really passionately cared about doing the best for patients. And the second is, he was one of the first people to show that you can take advances in our understanding of basic science and translate that into effective new treatments. So we talked a little bit earlier about the importance of research nurses and clinical trials. Because if we think about a situation where many patients need better treatments, then the way to unlock that progress is by creating access to the breaking new drug, transplant and cell therapy opportunities that are now at this moment of therapeutic inflection. That's a bit of medical jargon, isn't it? But it means as all of a sudden we can see almost a tsunami of really promising new treatments. But what we have to do is connect patients with those promising treatments, but at the same time, check whether those new promising treatments really work. Are they safe? Are they effective? And you do that through a clinical trial. And there are two forms of clinical trials. The first is what we call an early phase trial, a phase 1-2 trial, where you're checking, probably in a patient where the disease has come back and their treatment options are quite limited, is this new drug or transplant option, is it safe? How much should we give of it? And is there an early sign that it's promising? Okay. And then if the drug is safe, if you know how much to give, and you've got promising sign of activity compared with standard of care, then you do a randomized trial. So you compare the new treatment with what you would ordinarily get as standard of care. And those randomized studies generate the data that change the practice internationally. And so Cure Leukemia has played such a pivotal role in funding the centrally important infrastructure to allow clinical trials of these really promising treatments that patients need access to establish, are they safe and are they effective? And it's the research nurse that provides the extra bandwidth, expertise, capacity, and sits with the patient through this really challenging time that unlocks our ability, creates the capacity to do randomized trials. If we don't have research nurses, then what happens is that everybody's incredibly busy just delivering standard of care, and we don't move forward as quickly as we should, as patients deserve. But when you create, as Cure Leukemia has done, funding internationally significant research nurse networks covering large parts of the country, 25 or 30 million people, then you create an infrastructure that generates data, information, results that are not only relevant to the patients who had access to that drug that they may not otherwise have had, but change clinical practice internationally. I've just got back off a plane from the American Society of Haematology, and the networks that Cure Leukemia fund had 4 oral presentations. These are major events at the American Society of Haematology, 30,000 people from across the world there, presenting data, looking at new therapeutic options, attracting international interest that will change practice worldwide, just like we benefit from clinical trials done in Italy or the United States. But it's great because it's unlocking this huge potential in the UK to contribute to changing the face of what blood cancer treatment looks like.
It's so fascinating listening to you explain about the trials, Charlie, and I know firsthand how much work Cure Leukemia has been doing. But a patient's journey doesn't start with a clinical trial, does it? What can somebody expect as soon as they get a diagnosis of blood cancer, recognising that everybody's an individual and everybody's case may be slightly different? What does that journey for a patient look like from that day of presenting to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, Adam. The first thing we have to recognise, don't we, as well as what you've said, which is profoundly true, is that everybody's different and everybody's circumstance and everybody's support network is different. Is also that we're dealing with a whole bunch of diseases here, with lymphoma, with myeloma, with leukemias. And therefore that the diagnosis and the treatment are very much tailored to each other. But the first thing you would want to be understanding as a patient is, what is my diagnosis? The next really critical thing is this one of the more indolent leukemias, which we call chronic leukemias, which is certainly very important to treat promptly, but can be treated as an outpatient? Or do I need actually to go to hospital? Because one of the ways that leukemias present is that your blood counts are low, your white counts that fight infection are low, you're anemic, you have low platelet counts, and you can bleed. So the second bit is you have to be sure that for those patients with an acute leukemia, they're probably admitted to hospital, they get the necessary care to make them safe. That may be antibiotics or transfusions, everything like that. And then what, as a patient and as a clinician and a nursing team, you're wanting to do is to talk through with the patient what is the diagnosis and what are the treatments available. And also you need to be scoping out what are we looking for as milestones of treatment. And I think it's also very important, and this is probably in sequential conversations, to start giving people some idea about prognosis. Because some of the leukemias we treat now, thanks to advances in therapy, your life expectancy, if you respond well to treatment, can be almost normal. It's amazing. Okay. Jeff Thomas, who we may talk about later, if he had presented now, he wouldn't have needed a transplant. He would have had a tablet called imatinib, and his life expectancy would be pretty close to the normal person. Amazing. That wouldn't have been dreamt of 25 years ago.
So it's not a death sentence then?
So certain of these leukemias, you can be really encouraging. But there are other diseases where the treatment is intensive, you have a significant chance of not necessarily responding to treatment. And it's really important for patients in those circumstances to understand the gravity of the situation and the importance of the milestones that we're talking about, because they need to have conversations with their family, they need to be thoughtful about the implications. And I'm afraid to say, Adam, that there are some of the leukemias that are so difficult to treat with current treatments. You may even say, I'm not sure that actually sticking you in hospital to give you some treatment that's unlikely to work is in your best interest. It may be best to maximise your quality of life at home. But these are complicated discussions. And I think the fundamental principle is to inform the patient and empower the patient and the family so they can make choices.
And when you are doing that, Charlie, I'm guessing that sometimes the information you give at the start of their diagnosis will change. And they may have a very positive outlook, which then changes if they don't necessarily respond to treatment. How do you as a person deal with having those conversations? Because you've already told us earlier on that you get to know these people, they become friends of yours.
Yeah, so I mean, just to kind of step back from that a bit, I think it's the most important thing is to really be transparent about the information you're providing to the patient. Patients have to be able to trust their doc. So sometimes that means having really difficult conversations. Let's say when the leukemia has come back, because the treatment options then are very different. I think it's an easy mistake to shy away from bad news. If it is difficult news, patients need to know, because that has big implications for them. So I think we're now moving very much towards a position as, clinical teams, wherever you get treated, that nurses, clinical nurse specialists typically, and doctors sometimes in a couple of conversations, I try to give patient as much information. So you're talking about what's it like. I think that it's very important you try and build a relationship of trust with patients. It's really important that one tries to be as empathetic as possible. These are devastating diagnoses because you go from being fine and fit and everything's all right to having a life-threatening complication. And also the way that impacts people is very different, isn't it? Because we all have different considerations, different priorities. Let's just say you had a child who was going through secondary school and was struggling a bit. You know, for you as a mum, it's really important that you're around for that child of yours. And therefore, some of the treatment options you may wish to postpone to get through that. We also increasingly see as we apply effective treatments in older patients in their 60s and 70s, these patients often have caring responsibilities, maybe for their partner who's less well. So I think the other bit of it, Adam, is to try and open up as much of a dialogue with patients and understand that, as you said, everybody's situation is different. And we need to tailor not only the medical treatment, but also the whole holistic package of care according to everybody's distinct circumstances.
And do you find, I did it, and I made every excuse possible for my symptoms. One of my big symptoms before I was diagnosed was that I was covered in bruises. And I'd got lots of excuses as to why I was covered in bruises. And I put off going for help. Lots of other symptoms as well, which I just put down to every day generally feeling unwell. Is that an issue that you face, that patients are presenting later than you would ideally like them to present for medical help?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult. I think it's easy to say, well, you know, you should always go and see your GP when anything's not quite right. But I mean, the whole medical system will collapse.
We wouldn't do that, would we? No.
And it's also really important to identify that there are very clear examples where patients would have done much better if they had presented earlier. And so I do think you would like a situation where when patients have persistent symptoms or symptoms of, you know, bleeding is quite a significant symptom, isn't it? That they straight away see the GP, there's a blood count done, and then we can move ahead, all right? But I think also sometimes it's important to recognise that when you present with a leukemia, you have about 1,000 million cells of leukemia present. And that's been building up often for months. So I think the idea that just by getting early diagnosis fixes a lot of the problem perhaps lulls us into a sense of, you know, it's a bit more straightforward than it is. At the heart, patients with significant symptoms must see their GP, must get a blood count done promptly, and treatment must start as quickly as possible. But the fundamental thing is we need better treatments. And so we were talking about the conversation with a newly diagnosed patient and giving some information. And increasingly, the other part of that conversation, and it's now made possible by Cure Leukemia and the support for research nurses, is what clinical trials you might have available so that people can see that there are options. All the evidence is if you're treated on a clinical trial, you do better. We don't know why. Maybe it's an extra layer of care and support, but it's really important in 2025, as we have these new treatments, that as a patient, you're not only told about the diagnosis, what the standard of care is, but what are the possible trial options. And lastly, I think it's a very interesting new option is to actually allow your data to be collected. So this is called a registry, and Cure Leukemia has been pivotal in supporting a registry in the UK called MyCare for newly diagnosed patients with acute myeloid leukemia that will give really profound insights into how patients, what their outcomes like, equity of access to care, and also some quite important biological questions. So a rounded package of care will include information about current standard treatment options, trials, and access to registries. And there's a common phrase that's used, which I think has got some profound truth, which is every patient is a research patient, in as much as every patient should have the opportunity in some way to participate in studies that are aimed at improving their outcome and the outcome of following generations.
Cure Leukemia has been so successful in what we have done over the last 20 years. Are we learning quicker now than we were at the start of the charity? Are we making better advances now than we were in the charity's inception? And if I may, why do we even need Cure Leukemia? Is it all about money, Charlie?
So the answer to your first question is yes, there are more and more new treatment options out there. Certainly in the last decade, there are new treatments available to patients with a whole range of diseases that we never even dreamt of. So this is fantastic progress. Actually, you know, we talk about when we set up Cure Leukemia and the inspiration being patients who'd had access to this new drug. It's a drug called Gleevec, imatinib. And that was the first targeted drug in blood cancers. And it was extraordinary. I remember, I've just come back from this American Society of Hematology. In 1999, it was in New Orleans. It was very rainy. And I was there on the Saturday, and the plenary session in the afternoon was presented by a genius called Brian Drucker, who with John Goldman had been trying to translate our biological understanding, our deep understanding of what made that particular leukemia, chronic myeloid leukemia, grow in the test tube or in mice. And he teamed up with a pharmaceutical company, and they had a whole battery of drugs that potentially could target abnormal pathways in cells. And they managed to marry this up. And they found from this battery of drugs that Novartis had, there was one drug that seemed to be super effective against cells that had the particular leukemia abnormality that we saw in chronic myeloid leukemia. So Brian Drucker stood up on that Saturday afternoon in New Orleans, 1999, December, and he reported the first results from a trial using this new drug on patients with advanced chronic myeloid leukemia. They had months left to live. And it was like a Lazarus moment, because these people had been given one tablet once a day, and the great majority had gone into remission, were well, active and happy. And I remember sitting in that hall with about 6,000 other people, and you could just feel, and it was an electric moment. Because really up until then we had been dreaming that we could use all these advances in basic biology and having the fittest mice in the world to actually changing outcomes for patients in real life. And this was the first example. So what we saw after that led to the widespread trialling of this drug, Gleevec. That was the trial that our patients who set up Cure Leukemia went on to. And the reason Cure Leukemia has had a relentless focus on funding research nurses is because you could see that what was going to happen in the next decade was there was going to be a steady increase in the number of these new drugs and an ever greater demand for providing an infrastructure for patients to go on to clinical trials. And actually the pace of drug development by the pharmaceutical sector across the world has really been extraordinary. So I've just come back from this meeting in America, and we've been in conversations with international companies, drug companies, and there are really exciting, completely transformative approaches that have been developed through clinical trials. So I think it's a time of great promise now, Adam. It's a time of unprecedented promise for improving the outcomes for patients with blood cancer, and that's why there's that urgency. Focus on doing the simple stuff. Focus on funding nurses, focus on empowering clinicians and patients, and creating a world-class trials infrastructure in the UK so that benefiting from the size of our NHS, our ethnic diversity, and the skill set of clinicians and nurses in these hospitals, we can become the go-to destination in the world for clinical trials in blood cancer.
You're so passionate and determined, Charlie. Whenever I'm in your company, I never cease to be amazed by it. If you could wave a magic wand, just one moment in time as we are now, what would you change right now, without the obvious that everybody can be cured from leukemia? What's your magic wand going to achieve?
Yeah, so I think as we have more and more treatments, the opportunity to do more and more trials to connect patients who have such desperate need to new treatments gets bigger and bigger. And I think it's a money thing. So the extraordinary thing is that Cure Leukemia has shown that you invest £100,000 into this charity, that the research nurses open up trials that leverage more than 10 times that in free drug that patients can access because it's a clinical trial. So it's a highly leveraged business proposition in a way. And you can have such a clinical impact with the current network. But if we could double the number of research nurses in these centres, open more centres, put in a data management clerk, and buy out some clinical time for these really hard-pressed clinicians, you would double, treble the number of trials and accelerate the assessment of these new therapies. And genuinely, the UK would be the go-to place. So if we could conjure up £100 million over the next 5 years, and actually in the big picture, that's not a huge amount of money, then we would absolutely transform the clinical trial infrastructure. And I think that's a logical and rational ambition if we look at what our investment of at least 20 million over the last 10 or 15 years has done. 3,000 patients in networks funded by Cure Leukemia and other brilliant charities. 3,000 patients put onto prospective trials who otherwise wouldn't have been on clinical trials. Well, you turn up the dial in terms of the infrastructure, the nurses and the other folk I've talked about, and you've got a proven model. The question now is, how do you expand it, build it, and make sure that every patient who needs a trial has access to one? That's our moral obligation.
Some of those figures can be a bit bamboozling, Charlie, I must say. So if we use that figure of £100,000, you said we can times that by 10. How does it actually work? Because it doesn't initially make sense.
The benefits, the financial benefits of clinical trials, apart from the clinical benefits and the importance of offering patients new treatment, are actually very interesting. So a drug company will provide the drug free,
right,
for the experimental arm, but they will also provide funding, or the NHS actually will provide funding for the control arm also to be funded. So you suddenly find that there's a lot of patients being treated on a clinical trial who aren't sucking money out of the NHS. So you generate not only the cost of that drug, which can be many millions of pounds, but also you generate savings internally because patients on a trial aren't being funded through conventional NHS channels, but actually have an alternative route, much of it from investment by pharma. And so you very quickly tot up substantial savings within the system. And then finally, I think the other thing which a number of governments successively have to their credit identified is if we can continue to make the UK an attractive venue for clinical trial delivery across the piece, then you get growth of the life sciences economy. And that's private sector jobs in pharmaceutical companies. And Lord James O'Shaughnessy, who recently published a report for the government, estimated that if we fix the clinical trial delivery model for other diseases as well, that's an extra £5 billion into the exchequer.
The figures, that they really are incredible. But I guess bringing it right back to reality, you get to tell people that they're in remission, and after a period of time, like you did with me, you got to tell me that I was cured. Is that what you really work for?
Yeah, I think it's so wonderful to go on the journey with patients. And it's so lovely when you get a bone marrow that's in remission. And it's also so lovely because you can see the impact, the real impact that it has, not only on the patient, but on their family and everybody around them. And so I think it's the privilege, Adam, firstly, of knowing that the improvements in treatments are making such a tangible difference. And secondly, it is an unbelievably privileged position, really, to share this news with people, to see their response, but also to see their resilience, their humour as they go through. You know, it's a topsy-turvy world as you're getting intensive chemotherapy, as you will know. So that's the good stuff. The worst bit of my clinical existence is when you have to sit down with patients and say, particularly if they've initially had a good response, the disease is back. And I dread that, because you know that when you're talking to somebody about that, and that's the first time they've heard that news, it's almost like the hope goes out in their eyes.
Because, Charlie, what is remission? Because there will be people watching this now who are really early into their blood cancer journey, whether they are a patient or supporting a patient. So what is remission?
So when we talk about remission, it does differ slightly whether you've got leukemia, myeloma or lymphoma, but essentially it's after treatment we don't see detectable evidence of the disease. And once you're in remission, you're set up for a long-term excellent outcome on, in many patients, cure. So that's what you're aiming for. And then you're monitoring patients as they go through that progress to check the disease stays away. And the moment I was talking about, Adam, that is the moment of dread, really, is that sometimes it just comes at you far left field. You're not expecting it, is the disease has come back. And that's when clinical trials are so important, because quite often our standard of care for managing recurrent disease is just not good enough. And so it's very important to have this opportunity to say, well, we're in this situation, but there is a promising treatment that we can connect you to. Now, you can't, it's not the case that you can always do that, but increasingly we are saying to patients with recurrent disease, historically we would have been stuck, but there is this new option. Are you interested? And many patients, of course, are looking at something that offers hope. And so the only trials we'll put forward are drugs or cellular therapies that plausibly do offer hope. And the other thing that has always struck me about patients who want to go on trials in that setting is it's not only do they want new treatments, like anybody would, but there is also this sense of altruism, that they kind of recognize it doesn't necessarily 100% going to work. But even if it doesn't, they're part of this really important coalition of the willing to work together, to understand more about the disease and understand about new treatments. So they may benefit, but certainly other patients and the next generation of patients will also benefit. An enormous sense of altruism in patients who just want to do the right thing.
And Charlie, do you suffer exasperation or frustration? Because the name Cure Leukemia wasn't just plucked out of thin air. It's what you want to do. It's what we want to do. But when you are telling patients that their disease has come back, how do you manage that what can only must be a sense of real frustration?
Yeah, well, if I'm going to respond to that honestly, Adam, how does one convey that? I worry that I often convey it imperfectly. It's such a daunting message. I think one tries to be straightforward, tries not to use flowery language, tries to be honest, but I think also where it's realistic to offer hope. Because we are making so much progress. There are many patients I will be seeing in my clinic tomorrow sitting there happy and well who simply would not be in that situation if we'd looked at that 10 years ago. So there is realistic hope in these high-risk situations that we didn't previously have. And I think it's very important for patients to have the truth, but also to understand where there is hope, that you then pull together and go after the cure. Because one of the things I think patients might find very dispiriting is once you've had that difficult conversation that we're in this tough situation, which we may not have imagined we would be in, is if they keep getting reminded about how difficult it is. Once you've got that as an agreed challenge and you have a course of treatment, embrace that treatment and go for it with optimism. And quite often, your optimism is justified.
Charlie, are we ever going to live in a world without blood cancer?
Well, I don't think we're going to live in a world where people don't get blood cancer, right? Because blood cancer is just like one of those random awful things. It's like having a heart attack or a stroke. It happens. But I genuinely think we're going to move towards a situation where there are effective treatment options for all of these different blood cancers, so that patients can be offered not only more effective treatments, that's the priority now, to get more effective treatments, but also we talked a bit about kids, softer, kinder treatments. So a lot of children are now cured of these horrible leukemias, but there are some toxicities, particularly when you're a growing child, about getting chemotherapy. So we need to be thinking about two things. One is delivering highly effective treatment, gets rid of the disease, but also what we would call de-escalation, just trying to achieve that aim with less toxicity. Maybe giving treatment as an outpatient rather than as an inpatient. Maybe thinking about some of the toxicities we have with standard treatment and trying to limit those.
Because as you said earlier, this treatment and this blood cancer journey that a patient finds himself on, it can't necessarily become all-encompassing, can it, with the responsibilities that they have? What excites you the most? Thinking short-term, medium-term, what excites you the most about blood cancer treatment?
So I think what excites me most is that there's a whole bunch of treatments out there that are looking really exciting. I've just come out from this meeting in America, and the number of really transformative ways you can use cell therapy to tackle cancer. We wouldn't even have thought about it 5 years ago. Unbelievably exciting. The second thing that has excited me really is the sense that Cure Leukemia support for research nurses in big hospitals across the country has built a coalition of willing. James McLaughlin, the pretty inspirational CEO of Cure Leukemia, does this run around the country. He has a name for it. I can't remember what it is now. But I mean, it's pretty amazing. He runs like half a marathon every day for 15 days. I don't know how he does it. But it's fantastic because at each of those hospitals, he arrives and there's a whole team of people who are cheering him on, and there's cakes and there's a bit of a party, right? Certainly when he came to Birmingham, we had about 25 people greeting him. So I'm really excited, Adam, by the way that Cure Leukemia support for frontline, coalface clinicians and nurses has galvanized the sense that we can all pull together with a common aim of delivering practice-informing trials. And then I think the third and final piece, Adam, is the constant amazement I have at the resilience, the humour, and the determination of patients with blood cancer. So when a patient goes to such tough treatment and is cured, you like to say to them, a lot of this is down to you. And sometimes you sit there with a rational bit of your brain going, well, I don't know, it's the treatment and all these scientific stuff. But actually, do you know what? I think a lot of it is patients. And they show this amazing, brave spirit to get through it. So that's the other bit that buoys me up, is these personal stories of beating this disease. And I think Cure Leukemia has been fantastic at capturing the patient voice. So progress in the future will be all around empowering patients and making that patient voice louder and stronger. And that's important for a couple of reasons, right? So one is, I think it's very important in terms of getting fundraising in, that people can look at patient stories and go, wow, this is what can be achieved. Or, do you know what? If we don't achieve it, this is what happens. And I think we've done that story really well, but I think to give that voice to patients across the country is terribly important. And the other thing is, you were touching on it earlier, why do we need Cure Leukemia at all? I mean, why isn't this funded? Well, I guess if you look at the NHS budget and the pressures and everything, that there's a reasonable answer. Well, we just haven't got the money for this. The second thing is, I think, at a time of such rapid treatment evolution, I would suggest that the central government approach towards how you support clinical trials and what those trials look like and how you interact constructively with the pharmaceutical sector, I think that can be refreshed. So I think that Cure Leukemia's voice for saying these patients need drugs, need them urgently, need them now, and we need the money is incredibly important. So I think that the way that we articulate the earnest desire and our moral duty to patients through charities such as Cure Leukemia will become increasingly important.
And when you talk about the patients, as you just have, just while you and I have been talking now, over 100 patients will have been diagnosed with blood cancer. 1 every 27 seconds. There's a lot of people that we can help here, isn't there? Charlie, anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, so just a personal reflection. Recently, we were looking and working with a wonderful guy called Jeff Hill, who was head of ITN News. And his wife, Nat, came and gave us a talk. And she was talking about how Jeff had very difficult leukemia, and he hadn't been able to get onto a clinical trial for what we call, it's a new cellular therapy, CAR T. And Jeff subsequently passed away. And Nat gave this reflection, really, in front of quite a few people. And it struck me in 2 ways. The first was just the devastating loss, that Jeff wasn't with them and her, but wasn't with us. He became a great friend of Cure Leukemia. A sort of avoidable loss, really, because, you know, if we'd had all these research nurses, he could have had access to this treatment. And then the other bit that struck me was Nat said, come on, we're the 6th biggest nation, 6th biggest economy in the world. We have invested billions, trillions in the basic science that has allowed the generation of these amazing transformative new therapies. And yet we're in a position where patients or their parents or their grandparents, through their taxes, have so generously contributed to this basic research. We suddenly have these drugs like we're sort of now paralyzed that we aren't creating the necessary networks and the funding to connect patients to them. So my final thought, really, Adam, and that resonated what Nat was saying to us, is there's a moral component to this, because patients have paid for the information that they were promised. If there was a new treatment that was going to help them, they would rapidly access it. And at the moment, we have this gap in assessing new treatments as urgently, as quickly as possible, so they become approved if they're really exciting. And I think what Cure Leukemia has done to release the patient voice, to articulate this urgent moral need, it's not just blood cancer, it's other diseases. If there's new treatments, patients should see them really urgently, has been very, very important. And I finally think that Cure Leukemia should really be congratulated for focusing on research nurses and clinical trials from the get-go, and actually encouraging a constant re-evaluation of, are we serving patients in terms of their access to these new treatments as we should be, or as we would wish if it was myself or somebody that we knew in our family. And I think the patient-inspired Trials Acceleration Program, which was a patient idea, the patient inspiration towards setting up Cure Leukemia, I think it teaches us a fundamental truth, which is patients know a lot more than we recognize about what the unmet need is and about how we should urgently think of new models to address it.
Professor Charlie Craddock, CBE, I don't think anybody watching this could fail to sense your passion, your commitment and your determination to finding a cure for leukemia. Thank you for curing me. Everybody, you have been watching Let's Talk Blood Cancer, the Patients podcast. If you've got any questions at all or any ideas for what you would like to see on future episodes of the podcast, or perhaps any guests that you think should join me here on the sofa, please do pop it in the comments below. It's been great to have you here, Charlie, and thank you to everybody for watching.